This is Theory of Change. I'm Matthew Sheffield. Thanks for joining me for another episode. Before we get to the program today, I just want to mention that Theory of Change is part of the Flux Media Network, so go to flux.community for more podcasts and articles about politics, technology, media, and how they all intersect and affect each other. And if you like what we're doing, we have paid subscription options on Substack and Patreon. My thanks very much to everybody who is a paid subscriber. You are making the show possible. And if you can't afford to subscribe right now, please do tell your friends and your family about the show. That would be much appreciated. All right, so with that little plug out of the way, let's get into today's program. Large language models, the computer programs often referred to as artificial intelligence, are everywhere these days. There's a lot of hype, a lot of doomerism, and a lot of naysaying. But despite what all the commentators are saying, though, the current AI technology is not some magical god being or a tremendous scam. It is actually just a really useful technology that is going to be here in the long term. That makes it worth thinking about in more practical terms for what it means to us, you and me. How do LLMs work, actually, and how do we live with them? Joining me to talk about this is someone who's been asking those kinds of questions long before ChatGPT entered the international conversation. Venkatesh Rao is a writer, independent researcher, and consultant best known for his influential former blog, Ribbon Farm, and his incisive takes on technology, culture, and organizational behavior. Currently, he writes on his own website now called Contraptions. In the episode, we talk about Venkat's distinct approach to AI, seeing it not as a super intelligence, but as an emergent, messy, and deeply human technology shaped by what he calls mediocrity. Now, that might sound like a knock, but it's actually something more than that. It's a compliment, both to humans and to the human created technologies that we are exploring here today. I hope you'll enjoy. And joining me now is Venkatesh Rao. Hey, Venkat, welcome to Theory of Change.
Hey, Matthew. Happy to be here.
Yeah, so, and I'm really looking forward to this discussion because I think that you are one of the far too few people who is taking a more measured approach to AI. It's like 99% of people, it seems like, that are commenting about it tend to be relentlessly hyping it or saying that it's just a bunch of nonsense. And that neither one of those approaches seem to be correct, I think. And you've written as much quite a bit.
Yeah, it's with any big technology, I think if you start fundamentally with a stance of curiosity and trying to figure out what exactly you're even looking at, and that's your first order of business, you'll fundamentally go down interesting routes. Whether you end up being critical or positive about it, or um, you're like paying more attention to the upside or downside. If you don't start with curiosity, usually you end up in one sort of derp or the other. Either it's like, very predictable optimistic derp, or very predictable critical derp. So I think curiosity is the key. And I think um, the discourse we are hearing in public, you don't see much curiosity in evidence, because all the actually curious people, who I think are in fact the majority, they're too busy actually having fun playing with the technology to participate in the meta commentary around it. And of course, the engineers and scientists working directly on the production side of the technology, they're typically far too busy to join in the public discourse, except occasionally. And when they do, often they're incomprehensible to regular people. So the net effect ends up being what you're talking about, right? You have a lot of unimaginative, incurious discourse on both the positive and negative sides.
You do, and I actually see a strong parallel in this discourse with regard to vaccines. I think especially mRNA. That that here was this technology that had been around actually for a long time, and that's also true with language models, or what was I mean, you got the Eliza coming out in the I think it was the 60s. So as a technology, these are not new things per se, but obviously they're much different. Goes without saying. But and the same thing with mRNA. So it was a these were proven in the lab in some sense already for quite a long time, but because the people who had developed them were just so far removed from the public discourse that a lot of people had this natural suspicion of it, for something that's unfamiliar. So I can't necessarily fault that, but it is a failure of discourse on all sides in many ways.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think it's sort of the degree of the reaction rather than the direction of it that I think I use primarily to sort my responses. Like any new technology, whether it's extremely minor or very profound, like in this case, I do believe it's a very profound new technology. Uh, Ultimately, it's still made of like atoms. It obeys the laws of physics. It has its properties. Some of them are unexpected, some of them are expected, some you can model and sort of anticipate. Other things you just have to like fuck around and find out what it does. And sometimes you will I don't know, blow yourself up. Other times you will kind of like achieve miraculous effects, right? And you brought up vaccines. And yeah, I know you've spoken with Rene, who's been at the Rene Durista, who's been at the forefront of the vaccine debates for a while. And vaccines are kind of an interesting case. Rene was the one who told me about like even the original vaccines way back in the day. The exact same discourse repeated itself, and I think the key to recognize is that there's never going to be anything like a holy grail technology that only has positive effects and no negative effects. And there's never going to be actually be a technology that only has negative effects and no positive effects as well. And on the second category, I like to think of nuclear bombs, right? Like nuclear power is generally understood as a dangerous but generally positive technology. But if you ask people, do you think nuclear bombs are a good thing? Most would say like uniformly bad. But if you look at certain ideas for terraforming other planets, they're based on like exploding nuclear bombs and like causing positive climate change and making them habitable for humans. So events or like you want to like blow apart an asteroid that's coming at Earth, maybe a nuclear bomb is the right tool you need. So everything has both sides. And I think where it throws people who are not used to working directly with technology and like getting a sense of like its hands-on behavior as a real thing is they tend to inflate it to mythical proportions of either light or dark varieties. And they kind of insist on taking it in as a mythical thing. It's either a monster or an angel. It cannot be anything in between. Like, just like, we do this with other human beings as well. Like, your friends and people around you that you know well, you tend to like give them a lot of benefit of the doubt, and they inhabit a narrow range of human fallibility. It's like, there's kind of good people, kind of bad people, no outright cartoon villains, and no outright absolute saints, right? But when you encounter like a very distant culture, often you will do that kind of extremization. So I think part of that is what's going on. And in general, I'm like, yeah, critics need their room to have their reactions. But I think one of the ways in which I differ from a lot of other people in this discourse is I'm actually kind of happy to ignore the extremists on both sides. I don't think they matter in the long run at all. Like they'll be forgotten in a generation, and even if they're extremely noisy now, it's actually safe to ignore them. You don't have to counter them. You can kind of like wait for the noise to settle. You don't have to treat this as a debate that you must win, because this is at the extremes they can have powerful effects, right? Like if they get control of say regulatory uh, apparatuses and like how AI is regulated at the government level or international level, then you should start paying attention because they can have serious impact. But if all they're doing is shit posting and whining on social media and writing like inflamed editorials, they're kind of safe to ignore.
Yeah. Well, and there's another interesting parallel in that.
Arthur C. Clarke is famous for saying that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic, and people often apply that to these fanciful, sci-fi things that wouldn't exist for thousands of years, if ever. But it actually applies to technologies that exist in the current day,
Hmm.
and you really do see that not just with vaccines, but like with television, with as you said, nuclear power. I mean, just a variety of things. The internet was supposedly going to turn everybody into a Satanist, and so was rock music. Rock music was going to turn everybody into a Satanist and turn everyone gay. Like these were all things that were very confidently proclaimed by various people who were not. Didn't know how these technologies worked or really what they could be or the limitations that they had.
Yeah, and that's partly why I feel comfortable completely ignoring them. But I do enjoy analyzing the responses of people who are consequential. So yes, I know you kind of have a lot of interest in like unpacking the critical discourse, but I think for me a lot more value is to be found in analyzing the uh, discourse that's neither critical nor super positive, but just puzzle that responds to the mystery of the thing, right? Because there are things that are Arthur C. Clarke type mysteries, but only to lay people. Like you ask the experts who build the technology, they understand what's going on, even if the lay people don't. And a generation or two later, even the lay people catch on. AI is interesting in that even the people who know the most about the technology and are working at the in the depths of it, they struggle to understand what's going on, how to make up mental models of it. And I've been thinking about this aspect in terms of a wonderful book I read a couple of years ago by Benjamin Labatut. It's called When We Cease to Understand the World. It won a couple of major prizes. He's a Chilean author. But it's kind of a semi fictional, semi factual collection of like biographical stories of famous physicists who were the first to like encounter really profoundly new ideas and thoughts that were like crazy enough to drive people insane. So like the idea of a black hole, things like that, right? So the book is fascinating, and a recurring theme that happens is these pioneers who are the first to encounter these mysterious realities, they often don't know how to even wrap their minds around it, and many of them literally go insane or have like other psychotic reactions to it. So this was Labatut's theory, but then I came up with like a three-phase response theory for this kind of profound new technology. I think of it as the first phase is the Labatutian, when the first wave of people encounters this technology and has like an unprocessed first order response to it. Then you have what I call a Lovecraftian phase after, H.P. Lovecraft, the science fiction author, where you're starting to wrap your mind around what it is, what its shape is, how it behaves, but it's still fundamentally horrifying to you. And at that point, you come up with like basically Lovecraftian mental models of what it is. And we've already like speed run to that phase of AI. Like literally, we are using Lovecraftian models. We're calling AI Shogots. So Shogots, for those who are not familiar, is it's a species of ancient alien that Lovecraft imagines as part of the world, but it's an interesting kind of ancient alien. It's basically protoplasmic matter that's just below the threshold of being sentient or conscious, and it was created by another alien race that created it as kind of like a slave um, organic technology. But then it gets just smart enough to get into a war with the other regular aliens, and it's not surprising at all that the Shogot turned out to be a very interesting mental model for the Lovecraftian phase of uh, AI. And then the third phrase that I think of is I call it Ballardian after J.G. Ballard, another luminary of science fiction. And the Ballardian phase is, it's not that you fundamentally sorted out the mystery or like solved Arthur C. Clarke's sort of like conundrum of it looks like magic and you can't unpack it. Um, but at some level you've normalized your relationships with it, right? So like we get in planes all the time and fly at 40,000 feet in this amazing technology. We don't understand it. I'm an aerospace engineer by trade. long time. I haven't worked in aerospace for a long time. But yeah, one of the interesting things is we still don't understand fluid dynamics well enough to like have a clear, non-mysterious explanation for how lift works in wings. Like we have like the mathematics and we kind of get it, but at some level we don't understand how flight works. So it's still mysterious, magical technology, but it's not a Lovecraftian horror, right? Every time you get into a plane, you don't think about like Cthulhu and Shoggoths and other things eating you up. You don't have the paranoid, psychotic reactions that the early physicists had to like fundamental physics discoveries. So, flying in airplanes, despite remaining kind of magical, has reached its Ballardian kind of normalized phase. And I think we're starting to see that with AI too. Like, I'm fascinated by the number of like astoundingly banal but still very powerful things people are using AI for. Like a couple of examples from my own life, I found one of my hobbies is like tinkering with electronics. I'm not very good at it, but you can buy these cheap bags of assorted parts from like Chinese stores, and it'll come with like chips and parts and stuff. Um, with like sometimes a little chart showing the part numbers or something. You can just take a photograph of that, upload it to ChatGPT, and say, "What is this? Explain these components to me," and then suggest some experimental toy circuits I can build with this to learn how these components work. So that's like a kind of banal use I'm doing with it that's not profound, that doesn't have like a spiritual or epistemological dimension, but it's normalized. The magic has been normalized. And another one from my home life is my wife has discovered that it's a really great mentor for helping her make her own skincare products. So she likes making like face creams and things like that, and she's using it as a consultant chemist and formulary. And again, it's a lot of really banal conversations of like which ingredient will make the face cream more oily or less oily. But you're seeing this all over. Like, yes, the critics are still having their I don't know, pearl clutching reactions. The um, crazy theological boosters are still like talking about acceleration or doom or whatever, but the everyday people are doing surprisingly banal and normal things to it. Now, it's important though not to overstate this. Like, just because you can 99% of the things people are doing with AI are banal doesn't mean that Lovecraftian horrors can't come out of it as too, right? Like swarms of drones being programmed to attack military installations. We're already seeing that in wars around the world. So yeah, AI does have like profoundly powerful dark side technologies as well as uh, upside users. Like the number of proteins that had like plausible structures went from like around 3% to nearly 100% when DeepMind did its big protein model, right? So yeah, both these profoundly, I don't know, powerful things happen as well as completely banal things. But I think the overall shape of how AI is entering society, the person who's written, I think, most cogently about this is a professor at Princeton named Arvind Narayanan. He wrote this wonderful paper called AI as Normal Technology. And it presents a worldview that argues that this is not a fundamentally different kind of technology. You don't have to invent new religions and talk about like weird multiple universe thought experiments to think about it. You can think about this the same way you thought about nuclear technology, vaccines, many other big technologies. It is a normal technology. And I think, yes, that's kind of the frame with which to engage with AI.
Yeah, to be aware of the possibilities, but also the limitations, and really that's what it's about. And and I guess related to that is the concept that you have of mediocrity, and that people tend to. Yeah, I mean, mediocrity has a bad rap, but at the same time, everybody loves it for the things that they do, the things that they don't want to have to worry about. I mean, I think that that's probably you're talking about the banal applications of AI. What I mean, this is mediocrity available for everyone in as many things as you can imagine it. And but under as long as you understand the limitations, and so it's not good at current events. It's not going to help you with that. It's not going to help you with understanding the nature of reality, contrary to some of these people that get wrapped up in
Well,
Chat
I
GPT
wouldn't go that
God stuff.
far. I mean, it may not be good at that now, but it's certainly
Yeah,
trending in a way where it can help you with all those questions. It's
yeah,
gotten much better at current events, even in the 2 years I've been using it. The lookup and web browsing capabilities have really gotten good.
yeah.
Same thing with the first time I tried to have like a metaphysical discussion on the ontology of consciousness or whatever 2 3 years ago, it was like crappy. It was not even as good as like a bad sophomore smoking pot. Now it can hold up
Mhm.
its end of the conversation really well and challenge what I
Yeah,
think is my relatively sophisticated view on that topic. So anything it can't do, I think it's important to qualify with yet. Like a lot of people
yeah.
are rushing to judgment on it fundamentally cannot do X because they've come up with their own pet theory. You have one, I have one, a dozen other people I know have these kind of like metaphysical treatments of what AI is that leads them to pose
Or
what
what
I
it
think of
is,
as
or what it isn't, I would say.
yeah, like pseudo theorems of fundamentally AI cannot do X because I have this abstract model of it that says it cannot. So this is like all those people who said heavier than air flight is impossible. Well, your model was wrong. It turned out not that heavier
Yeah,
than air flight was not possible. So I would
yeah.
say anything you think AI cannot do, you should qualify with yet, the word yet,
Right.
right? And anything it
Sure.
can do, it'll probably do better, but it may not ever get to like super intelligent or super capable version. This is why I'm a huge skeptic of like generalized claims of super intelligence or even general intelligence. Like if you talk about computers being better than us in some narrow way, that's been true for like 70 years. They were already better than us at arithmetic 70 years ago, and other things like image recognition, translation. 15 years ago, they were better than us in some ways. But other things, yeah, they may reach like maybe a ceiling of mediocrity that's below us. Sometimes they'll be slightly better, and this is because intelligence is fundamentally not a quote unquote thing that has generality to it. Like we've fooled ourselves into thinking about intelligence as a generality thing because we kind of hallucinated this idea of a G factor in the statistical results of IQ testing. And it's like a whole house of cards that allows us to think in terms of intelligence as a generality thing. But to connect to your point about mediocrity, the AI aspect of it is at the very origins of AI, of course. Like if you look back to Turing's original formulation of the Turing test, he kind of like made like a half cynical version of the formulation, which is, hey, I'm not aiming to create like a really superior intelligence. I just want to create a mediocre intelligence, something like the president of AT&T. And this was basically him snarking at the this happened in the AT&T Bell Labs cafeteria, and he was saying it loudly because the president was just walking in and he wanted to troll the guy, right? But there's something important there. Like AI is, I think, profoundly high potential and powerful technology because it's mediocre. It does things in like these fumbling human-like ways that suggest vaster, broader potential. Whereas if it did one thing really, really well, right? Airplanes fly hundreds of times faster than humans can run, so they do one thing really, really, really well compared to humans. But it's because of that we kind of aren't scared of airplanes. We just think of them as it's a specialized technology. We know exactly how it works, and we aren't afraid that suddenly airplanes will start doing better philosophy than us because airplanes are like so good at being faster than
Yeah.
us. That is evidence that they're not the kind of thing that can be that can compete with us on
A
other
threat.
fronts. But
Yeah.
it's the mediocrity, and the reason this is like a profound philosophical theme that I push on. So partly I do it to troll people because we live in an age of excellence and hustling and things like that, and it's fun to be the bad guy pushing like a meme everybody hates. But also I do have like foundational beliefs on why mediocrity is like a fundamental property of the universe. Like take for example Darwinian evolution. A lot of people who haven't actually studied the nitty gritty of mechanics of evolution have this weirdly dumb idea that evolution is an optimizing process, that it somehow gets better and better at quote unquote fitness, and then it creates like the optimized version of everything. No, it doesn't. It's actually really, really good at not getting trapped in like local optima. It gets bumped out. And what evolution is really good at is actually maintaining enough reserves of evolutionary potential so that it can adapt to completely new circumstances. And there's a whole book about this view of evolution. I think it's called Good Enough. So it's by an evolutionary biologist that uh, explores various examples of how uh, how evolution does not in fact optimize and like get everything to the 99% performance range. Like a simple example I like to use is the reason we have ears is of course the three little bones in our ear. Those tiny ear bones that are part of our oral canal and allow us to become hearing agents, they actually were the result of evolution working on the surplus material in our jaw bones. So our jaw bones were not optimized. They were like, in a sense, fat. Like, they were not lean, they were fat. There was too much bone for the job. Our jaws were too strong for the kind of food we had to eat. So this is not true not just of us but all mammals, and therefore some of that surplus material, when the environment of evolution was right, it evolved into ear bones, and then we got this extra ability to hear out of the surplus material of unoptimized ears. And this is how all evolutionary processes work. There is slop, there is fat, there is noise in the system that bumps it out of local optima, and the global processes, there is no global optimum to search for because it's a constantly changing adaptive fitness landscape. So evolution is constantly probing and trying to like chase a moving target. It never quite lands. It's always chasing the moving target of how is the world changing and how can I keep up in a good enough way. So that's mediocrity in evolution. And you see this in like human cultural evolution too. So my favorite example of that is there's this wonderful paper by, I think the author is Chambliss. It's called The Mundanity of Excellence. So he studied competitive swimmers in swim meets, the league stack of leagues of swim meets, and he discovered something very interesting. The finest swimmers who get all the way up to Olympic grade, they typically don't actually max out their potential at any given lower level of competition. What they do is once they get good enough to like consistently start winning at, say, city or state or high school or whatever level, they don't try to like set world records at that level. At that point, so maybe at the 70% level, they start actually making changes to their technique. They start experimenting with new ways of swimming. They find new coaches that break them out of their rut, and they level up. So they go from, say, the 80% tier of one level to, say, the 50% median level of the next tier, and then they start improving there. So they never go to the end of the S curve on any one level. They jump to the next S curve, right? So this is what Chambliss means by mundanity of excellence. It looks like excellence when you look at the end product and you're looking at an Olympic grade swimmer, like looking like a completely out of the world alien, but they didn't get there by chasing excellence at each level. They got there by understanding how to stay in the zone of mediocrity at each level, but then simply leveling up so that what was trending towards excellence at one level simply becomes mediocre at the next level, and you can't continue to improve by doing the same things you used to do. So this is kind of like my natural history of mediocrity across AI, biological evolution, and human cultural evolution. And this is why I find AI so exciting. It's not one thing that you can do Lean Six Sigma on and like Toyota lean manufacturing approaches on and polish to like a absolute state of perfection. There are technologies that do that and they're great. They go into like a local minimum and they serve us well there. They become completely perfected and kind of recede into the background where we can forget about them. They just serve us in the background. But there are technologies that are open ended in this mediocre evolution way, and they can kind of like be our co-evolutionary technologies for the rest of our existence. So those are powerful technologies indeed. That's why I'm so excited about AI.
Yeah. Well, and it is a fundamentally different approach to technological development, as you're saying, because and we saw during the pandemic that these perfected technologies of supply chains, they had extracted all possible value and all possible, minimized all possible waste. But what that did is that made them fragile, and it made it so that they broke when they had to deal with any sort of variation, and that's and that's another parallel with evolution, so that the fact that appendixes exist shows that evolution does not maximize for all waste, to minimize all waste and maximize efficiency. But that's why it works, is
Yeah.
because there waste in some sense is good, and
Yep.
what people call waste is actually capacity that is necessary to handle future disruption.
Yeah, I think the mistake made by maximalists and optimizers of any sort is the belief that any reserve capacity or surplus you have must be used towards goals you already have. So if you want to run faster, every ounce of like reserves of any sort you have must be used up in going faster and faster. But maybe going faster is not actually the adaptive thing to do next week. Maybe what you want to do is lift the heaviest object, which means you have to start doing something else with your reserves, right? And the supply chain example is kind of interesting actually, because I think more recent research on what happened during COVID is adding like a twist to the tale. So it turned out that the supply chains weren't actually fragile in the way people thought. They were actually capable of meeting the demand and like keeping up. What actually broke them was extremely poor regulatory responses. So one version, like a crude version of the story, is governments around the world gave too much by way of cash stimuli to citizens to tide them over the period. And because there was also inflation starting to get underway and cash is worth less during an inflation, people were hurrying to buy far more than they actually needed. So it wasn't that the supply chains were not fat enough to do the job of meeting like enough demand to weather the pandemic, but they didn't have enough fat to also deal with above and beyond stimulus mechanisms and poorly conceived economic management regimes. And even within this, there are tweaks. So I used to do a bunch of consulting work for Amazon at one point, and Amazon actually survived the pandemic surprisingly well because it basically built up its own shipping logistics fleet with its own ships, its own agreements with different ports, and therefore, when basically the global trade system based on national treaties and like movements of goods and services, it started to break down because governments were like mismanaging what was happening. Amazon's own system actually was much more robust, so they actually managed to continue serving their customers a lot better, right? So it's not a single story, but I think the overall lesson to take away from COVID is no matter how well you plan, there will be contingencies that are not in the thinking that went into the design of a system, that are not within living memory. So maybe you have to dig back 100 or 1,000 years to find appropriate things to learn from. And the only way you can actually deal with them well is to have unallocated fat in the system. And there's a lot of good research that supports this basic conclusion that the only way to survive long term. So there's a book called The Living Company that came out of research from BP in the 80s. But the headline conclusion there was the companies that last the longest simply have two properties. One is they have enough reserves and surpluses to like weather a lot of uncertainty. And the second is they are open to ideas. So they're not closed off, they're not hidebound in their thinking. So that's really it. You have to have reserves and you have to be open to like external inputs that can like give you new ways to behave. If you close yourself off or you uh, you know get your reserves down too far, you will die. That's basically it.
Yeah, it is, and there, I mean, there are so many companies that are examples of that. I mean, just I mean, like mobile phone technology. How many times that the top players, just completely cease to function in the market. I mean, that's happened so many
Yep.
times now. Just as one example, but so I mean, the other thing though about just in the AI context is that I think that people who people are still trying to figure out, well, how can I use this thing? Because like that's and it's not going to be the same answer for everybody. And some answers that people have, or that they want to have at a given moment might not be functional for what they need at that moment. but it might be extremely useful for somebody else, so like, and I think a great example is art. That the capabilities for art generation just were horrible for such a long time, and people would mock it and things like that. But if you try it now, it's very good. Like, a lot of it's very good, and I mean, and there are legitimate concerns because visual representations are in some ways more, there's not as many of them as linguistic permutations. And so artists have some very valid concerns in this regard, but compared to linguistic recombination, because I mean, we have so many words that, the number of possible permutations to make a sentence, we're talking in the quadrillions here, right? So nobody can really say per se that that AI is going to rip off their writing. Although obviously we have instances of that, but art is a different thing. But nonetheless, the capabilities got there, and are just only continuing to improve, like with video and things like that. So it's that. And then other people are getting their brains messed up by using AI improperly and not understanding that it's not a this is not a spiritual advisor. You should not take religious advice from a chatbot. But the media is trying to hype that now, I think, in a lot of ways. But as you had, we had talked before this, you had said that AI is more of a is like, the product you get from AI is related to what you put in, and it's what you expect. It's almost like
Yeah.
the Yoda scenario with Luke in The Empire Strikes Back. It's AI is only what you take with you, in a lot of sense.
Yeah. Uh, So I think I'll probably come across as an extremist on this particular topic with respect to attitudes that are prevalent today in living generations. But in historical time, I will probably come across as a moderate. So with that qualifier, let me explain the position I'm outlining here. I'm an extremist on thinking copyright is bullshit. So what do I mean by that? Like, in language, it's kind of easy to see. Like, if you go back far enough in history and you look at, say, the pre-printing press, epic literature or folk traditions and stuff, there was no notion of, like, one person laying claim to the Arthurian legends, for example, to take a random example I'm reading at the moment. The Arthurian legends is a good example to take. They evolved as a folk tradition across France and England over several centuries. They were at some point like compiled in France in various clusters. There was Geoffrey of Monmouth, who had a history of kings of England and so forth. And at some point in around 1480s or so, Thomas Mallory came up with the Death of Arthur, which is the definitive edition. But the reason it got locked down as the definitive edition, and he became known as quote unquote the author of the King Arthur tales, is the printing press was invented. And the printing press, when it was invented, it introduced a certain kind of like freezing, or there's this book by Elizabeth Eisenstein called The Printing Revolution and Its Impact on Europe, where she talks about this notion called fixity. It took a lot of fluid traditions that had huge numbers of people chaotically contributing to it and introducing kind of a fixedness to it. And at the same time, it kind of like created this archetype of an author as a figure in the public imagination that had a certain relationship with a fixed work. And that relationship is what eventually got legal teeth as what we now understand as copyright. Same thing with, like, visual arts, right? Like, you go look at very traditional painting techniques before the Italian Renaissance in Europe and much later in other parts of the world. You will find that authorship is a very sort of loose and fluid concept. Like, you look at ancient temples in Asia, you'll have like lots of like carvings and paintings. Nobody knows who the hell did them. They were like parts of, like, long time traditions where everybody collectively owned a commons of creative production knowledge, and they were used to, like, decorate public works. And copyright was not necessary to mediate human relationships with their collective output. So I think one of the things we're seeing right now is the printing press, in some sense, created a few centuries of a very anomalous relationship between human creative labor and the products of that labor that was very individually circumscribed by a particular legal regime, right? And it didn't exist before about 1450. And I suspect it will not exist again after about 2100, because we are now getting back to a mode where our relationship to uh, our artistic production is at some level a fractal collective mutualist thing. Yes, there's individual threads to it, but there's also group threads to it. There's like national threads to it. Let's take an example, like, the big furor over Studio Ghibli. Now, Miyazaki is a very well-known animator, and deservedly so. He's like done legendary movies, and they're like, for what they are, they're exceptionally good movies. But it would be a bad mistake to pretend that Studio Ghibli, which is the studio he runs, is solely the author of the works of Studio Ghibli. Even if you go beyond Miyazaki and say, let's count the 100 or so artists who have worked on like Studio Ghibli movies for the last 30 years, even that's not a big enough circle. He had a lot of inspiration from Disney and American animators earlier in the century. He had a lot of inspiration from earlier traditions in Japanese visual arts. So you start counting up and rolling up all these collective legacy and inheritances of human creative labor, and you find that there is something, I don't know, deeply self-absorbed and narcissistic and individualistically small-minded about a relationship to the artistic tradition that I have a big problem with. So I think we're going to go back to the preprint era of like more collective ownership of commons of artistic production. So that's one half of what I want to say, but I don't want this to be mistaken as excusing the ethical responsibilities of AI companies, right? So I disagree with the hypocrisy of individual artists, and also they're kind of like performative gestures, like, putting little notifications on their articles or artwork saying, hey, no AI was used in this. Bullshit. You use the equivalent of like thousands of years of human creative production as an artistic heritage, which is the equivalent of a LLM in pre-computer eras. So you did use an LLM. The LLM just happened to be human history itself. So that's one way to think of it. So yes, I don't let artists off the hook for being bad faith and disingenuous about the arguments they make. But this is not the same thing as excusing, OpenAI or Anthropic or any of them. They have an ethical responsibility too, but they need to work it out for themselves who that is to and how to actually deliver on that responsibility, right? Like if they think they're drawing on a lot of commons tradition from the internet or the long history of humanity, they should give back to that tradition, right? They should like release open source weights. Uh, they should leave the commons of human artistic heritage richer than they found it. They should not leave it extracted and devastated. So anything that's going into the LLMs, yes, they have as much right to it as any individual artist. But what comes out of LLMs, I think it should create a new commons, and it's starting to happen. The private companies are not exactly doing great work here, but the people pushing hardest on open weights LLMs, for example. And it's kind of ironic that China is the leader on this with DeepSeek and others, that they're like going really hard at this. But beyond that, we need even better. Like uh, there's a couple of efforts to do basically public commons AI. So Kevin Kelly has this notion of public intelligence, and I just came across this. Let's see if I can find. This thing. There's another effort to build a truly fully open source stack around AI. Yeah, I'll share it later if I can. But yeah, there's a bunch of efforts that's happening like this that are about like building AI in a distributed, open access, public way that leaves the commons much richer than they found it. And I think, yeah, I mean, to some extent there's a there's a humanitarian concern here, like, just as traditional artisans and craftspeople who do like who sit around in villages around the world practicing like centuries old crafts, they kind of deserve to be somehow taken care of when technology messes with what they're doing. Today's modern artists deserve the same like humane considerations, but we should not take their ethical posturing at face value any more than we should take the ethical posturing of the AI companies at face value. We basically need to renegotiate our collective relationship with our knowledge and art heritage
Mhm.
in a completely new way. Like what's had worked for the last 500 years won't continue to work.
Yeah, and I would say the same thing also applies to software patents as
Mhm.
well. And because I mean, when you look at the way at the technologies that go into pretty much every model, they're based on open source technologies, and
Yep.
in many ways. And so, and I suspect that if somebody were somehow to do an audit of these technologies, there would be a lot more that is under the hood that is not being disclosed. Perhaps that is
Yeah.
my suspicion.
And there's even a pragmatic, selfish reason to promote this commons and open source and public view of things. So, whenever we think of the evolution of technologies, often people note that the end stage of any technology is quote unquote commoditization, at which point it either becomes like there's no alpha left in it, or it even becomes a nationalized utility run by the government or something. There's something not quite true about it, right? Like trains became nationalized and became like a commons commodity like 100 years ago, but then new technologies came up for maglev, new kinds of like train technology, and the frontier opens up again. Now the question is, what do you do with technologies that go through a cycle from like frontier pioneering innovation to a temporary commoditized stage when the frontier shuts down? So maybe for 50, 60 years nothing new happens in that sector, but there is still like subterranean forces that can erupt at any moment and restart that sector, right? So you kind of have to be open to that potential reopening. And I think the best way to steward that latent potential that might reopen 50, 100 years down the line is in fact as a public commons, not as a nationalized public, by that I mean nationalized government entity, or as completely extracted private sector. You kind of have to have like a commons approach to stewarding late stage technologies, because that's how you nurture their long term potentialities. And I think we're just starting to learn the societal disciplines needed to do that well. Open source software is one of the first cases where we've learned how to do that well. Like, we are not saying that, hey, this kind of software is really old. Like, take word processors. There have been word processors for 50 years. But what we are not doing is saying, hey, this is old enough. Let's give it to IBM to maintain as a legacy technology, and IBM's Department of Word Processing can do it. We're not saying that. Nor are we saying, hey, this is basically a utility technology. Let's give it to the government to run in the Department of Word Processing Technology. Both would be absolutely terrible ideas. Just because word processing as a class of application has kind of matured doesn't mean it's going to stay the same 50 years from now. Like, AI is actually opening up that frontier again. Like, what it means to work in an environment like Google Docs or Microsoft Word is being radically rethought now with AI being plugged in, right? So obviously there's going to be very new kinds of word processing in the next 5 6 years. So that means we need to learn how to steward these things really well. And yeah, commons, open source, these are all going to be societal disciplines for us now.
Yeah, and and the other thing about this perspective is getting technologists themselves to not be paranoid about a matured technology. So, like, we see, Peter Thiel, I think, is infamous in this regard for claiming that, oh, we don't have any innovation anymore. Innovation's dead, and it's all the communist fault or whatever. And it's like, well, no, because, as you said, word processing, spreadsheets, these are things that largely we figured that they're mature technologies any more than we don't need to have a new astrolabe technology. And we're not lamenting that we don't have any new astrolabes. They're fine with what we have. And the real innovation is in either completely extending existing mature technologies, or inventing new things that do the same function. And that's I think that there is of late, especially as some investors and have in fact tech liberation types they haven't understood this point that a
Yeah.
maturation is not a bad thing; it's a
Yeah.
good thing.
I I would characterize their views slightly differently, but this is fine for our conversation here. Yeah, I think Peter Thiel is kind of an overrated idiot on these topics, honestly. Like his famous line about Twitter versus, I wanted flying cars, I got 140 characters. It's sophomoric. Like he was once described to me as his thinking stopped with Lord of the Rings and Ayn Rand, and he has apparently read some Rene Girard, and I think he's overrated. He placed a couple of good bets as an investor, and he's really smart as an idiot savant kind of way in certain kinds of behaviors. But I wouldn't take his views on this sort of thing seriously. But what's a sophisticated view of the maturation and I would say reawakening of technologies? It's that nothing is ever done. Like even astrolabes are not done. It could be that the next interesting technology that we invent suddenly does something very weird to astrolabes. In fact, they've not been done. Like people have been updating astrolabes with lasers and other like smaller refinements. But
Yeah,
to take a similar era of technology, sails, for example, sailing technology reached a peak of perfection with, I would say, the 1850s tea clippers just before steamships in America. Great, phenomenal sailing ships. They wouldn't hold a candle to the sailing ships we see in the America's Cup type races today, right? Because these new sailing ships, they use fiberglass, they use like complicated like computing CFD software to optimize the sails. If you've ever seen one of these yacht races, it is amazing. These things fly like far faster than any sailing ship 200 years could. So it's not true that we've lost or that it's stagnant or only incremental things are happening. And it's not even just like it's not that it's a marginal sideshow because of climate change and energy concerns. People are actually now starting to build cargo ships that use wind power in powerful new ways. So there's a few new designs for there's literal sails that are like carbon fiber based that are used on container ships, and then there's other things like there's a form of wind propulsion that uses rotating cylinders. That was a type of wind power that was never used at all in the earlier sailing era. So yeah, you can't write off anything. So nothing is
yeah,
a finished story until our species is dead and Earth is burned to a cinder. It's like the game isn't over until it's over. So uh,
yeah.
it's
And I'm sorry,
important. Yeah,
just on your point on sailing, like the other thing, the technology is continuing to be extended even further because like with spacecraft and
yes,
using the solar wind, like
exactly.
that's the ultimate application of sailing innovation. And if people
Yeah,
hadn't kept thinking about, how can we refine how it works with wind, we wouldn't
yeah.
have had that.
And astrolabes too, like this has been standard on spacecraft since the beginning. One of the ways satellites do attitude positioning, so they have lots of methods to do it, but one of them is literally star scopes. So they have like little tiny telescopes that orient on particular stars, and then they use that to like get a sense of like their orientation and like correct them, because they need multiple redundant systems to position themselves. So yeah,
Yeah.
astrolabes are alive and well.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and I guess in some sense, there's the other thing about that's kind of circling back in a lot of ways is that that AI is kind of it's opening up the idea of what is consciousness, what is intelligence,
Yeah,
in a way that hasn't really been thought about for a long time. And one person who I don't think he gets enough discussion nowadays. I don't think, or and maybe I'm reading the wrong stuff, but like Marvin Minsky's Society of Mind. So that actually appears to be true of both humans and of LLMs. That so
yeah,
LLMs function, through and the analogy is not a very good one with the idea of a neuron, but nonetheless, the idea that a token has multiple relationships across many different spaces, and so basically an attention head algorithm is functioning in the same way that a neuron in a human or animal is. That our consciousness, there is no fixed self. It doesn't exist, and really what that's, I think, in some ways is kind of scary to people who want to imagine that there's something magical inside of us. But when we look at, other animals like dolphins, they have language, they have abstract thinking, they have names for themselves, with their signature whistles. There's just, we're not nearly as special as we think we are. And I think that that might be ultimately what motivates a lot of people who are, obsessed about things like qualia or stuff like that. It's just, and it's fine. Like, understanding that we're not that special. That's, I think that mediocrity there, like, that's the ultimate mediocrity, perhaps.
Yeah, we have a very mediocre flavor of consciousness, not a special flavor. But yeah, I think this is one of the threads of discourse that are most worth watching, uh, which gets to the point I think we were talking about before, in our prep call, on like AI as a mirror, right? Like, a lot of people have pointed out that every technology that's ever come along, every major technology, let's say, people tend to like see their own minds reflected in it. But I think AI is indeed special because it's the first technology that was literally inspired by our own, well, not our own brain, but cats' brains, because the first neurons that were studied that eventually became neural networks was cat neurons. Uh, so yes, AIs are special. They're not like, um, if you look in, say, the era of Descartes, you would find like clockwork analogies for how the mind works, and he had an idea that consciousness lives in the pineal gland and things like that. But clockworks are good for understanding certain aspects. So it's an okay mirror. It's not a high quality mirror. You can understand some aspects of brain functioning that way. But AIs are exceptionally good mirrors. And yes, Minsky is, I think, one important thread of understanding what both AIs and brains are. And I think we're getting closer and closer to that model. Like, the latest mixture of experts model, that has now become the standard architecture. It already has like a multiple agent structure. It's still a little bit of like a hierarchical architecture that I think is not quite close to the way the human brain works, but it's getting there. So I would say today's AIs in the mixture of experts architectural paradigm, they're somewhere between uh, a Cartesian theater approach where the prompts come in and then they fan out to the mixture of experts and so forth, and a future state where we perhaps won't need that, like when we have embodied AIs and robots that have their own sensors and actuators, and that loop is closed in a richer way. We'll kind of like drop even this slight fiction of a Cartesian theater that we have going on in current AI models. And it's getting there. Like, on the models front, a lot of people are getting inspired by cortical columns, which are these structures within the brain that have, I would say, Minsky society of mind resonant architecture. So that's one direction that's interesting to watch. Another interesting direction is, this is a little bit of like a cultish line of research, but it still is interesting. It's on active inference stuff by Carl Fristum and people who study things like the free energy principle and so forth. So people building models of the brain, not as thinking and cognitive machinery, but as thermodynamic systems described in terms like, entropy, free energy, flows of energy, and signals of information. So there's lots of really interesting work happening along those lines. And I think really exciting stuff is going to happen once we start putting LLMs and LMMs and like, multimodal models of all sorts into robot bodies, adding like reinforcement learning loops and operationalizing some of these newer models of like, a free energy principle and active inference. And what will happen then, I think, is we will lose this, we'll lose what's left of this Cartesian theater metaphor that's still lingering with us, and we'll get to uh, AI embodiments that can mirror human thought much more richly. I think at some point they'll start
Yeah.
diverging because silicon and neurons are fundamentally different types of hardware. So they
Yeah.
will start diverging. They've already started diverging with transformers. It's not quite the same way neurons work, but
Yeah.
they will be equivalently expressive. And by that, I mean that even if they turn into completely alien intelligences that are nothing like us on the inside and think very differently, they will still work as the most expressive mirrors we have, where when we interact with them, we will in fact be able to like see ourselves in them. And yeah, to go back to your earlier point, have conversations about like philosophy and spirituality if you're so inclined, and have that be as good or better or more interesting than with other humans. Like we don't
Yeah.
have to like rank all these on the same scale. Like, talking to a great philosopher about your religious views might have one kind of value, but talking to the best AI model 20 years from now about your views on religion might have a completely different kind of value. Like,
Yeah.
just like um, sitting around on your couch with your dog or cat and communing with another species that way is a fundamentally different spiritual experience than talking to another human with whom you resonate a lot. And I would say they're like equivalently valuable. Like when I sit with my cat and we're watching TV together, it's a very different but equally valuable spiritual experience as talking to somebody who's sophisticated about those topics.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and ultimately, I mean, I think that the where we're headed with all this stuff is that within cognitive psychology, there is the broad consensus that there are two types of reasoning. There is our somatic reasoning, our bodily based preservation instincts, things like that, and then there's our abstract reasoning, and AI, because it hasn't been embodied yet, it doesn't have that somatic reasoning. And so, but that ultimately is the foundation of all meaning, because David Hume was right, when he was talking about this, hundreds of years ago, that that our reason is and forever will be the slave to the passions, and that this must be the case, and it should be. And so, like, that's ultimately what meaning is that me as a physical being in limited space time, this is where I see things, and this is what matters to me. And
Yeah.
that's, I think, is ultimately, and so whatever the substrate is, whether biological or mechanical, that doesn't matter as much as that meaning can be created.
Yeah, and I think we're already getting there. Like embodiment is farther along than people realize. Like already people are sitting in, self-driving cabs, and like after 5 minutes, the novelty wears off. Like that's what happened with me when I sat in a Waymo. But this is a beast with like a lidar and a lot of sensors and loops, and it has a certain situated, organic, embodied presence that is very different from interacting with chat gpt. It's a very different type of intelligence. And yeah, I think the philosophical track you're gesturing at is in fact the right one. So Hume, I think, came a little too early to he's a useful thinker on these matters. But if you fast forward a little bit, I think Gilbert Ryle is the philosopher to think about quite a bit these days. And
Mhm.
to some extent, Heidegger. Like I'm not a huge fan of Heidegger. There's lots of problems with his thinking, but some of his ideas about like being in the world, and how embodiment and what you're calling the somatic aspect of consciousness have this interplay, they're really interesting. So there's a line of Heideggerian thought that I found interesting, which comes out of his otherwise kind of like crappy philosophy of technology. But he has this notion of like, readiness at hand and readiness to hand, of how a
Yeah.
tool integrates into your body. And a bunch of philosophers like Simon Dunn and lately Byung-Chul Han and others, they've carried on the Heideggerian tradition. And they're starting to say very interesting things about how being and embodiment work in the modern world. Uh, their views colored by the general kind of like dismal nature of Heideggerian thought. So if you can pull that out and like,
Yeah.
I don't know,
Get
cheer it
past
up a
the
little bit, yeah, it's a
yeah.
useful vein to think of. And Gilbert Ryle, I think, is underrated. I have to go back and read more of how he came at these problems. But yeah, there's a lot of philosophical work to be done, and I think more and more exciting raw material will come for the philosophically minded in the next 10 years. And I think the same thing I say to people who are like trying too hard to optimize their AI experiences right now. I would say to philosophers as well. So a lot of the AI hustlers, as I like to call them, they very eagerly make up like really complicated prompts and recipes and things like that. And I'm lazy. I just use AI right out of the box. And my response to those people is, you're doing all these complicated things. It'll be obsolete in 3 months because the models themselves will become sophisticated to do that. Like, initially chain of thought prompting was something you had to do manually. Now it kind of just does it, right? So it's very valuable to be lazy these days, like both as a hands-on technology user, just be lazy, because anything you try to overdo, chances are the technology will do it better in 6 months. And I think the same is true of philosophy. Like, if you're very energetically trying to form conclusions about, like, consciousness or qualia or something, I would recommend just be a lot more lazy, because 6 months from now you'll probably see 3 or 4 very intriguing new things happening in AI that'll actually lead you to better conclusions. So I think my current stance is play around and find out and experiment in a playful manner with the actual technology, but really, as much as possible, leave the questions open without like feeling an urgent need to answer them. It's more important right now to collect the good questions than to find the good answers, because so much interesting data is coming our way that we'll keep finding better and better answers as the years go by. Exciting
Yeah.
times. Yeah.
Yeah. Ultimately, what matters is what you can do with it, not what you can, what slot you can put it in. I think that's what it comes down
Yeah.
to. Yeah. All right. Well, we could probably keep going for a lot longer, but I don't want to do that to everybody. But so for people who want to keep up with your writings and such, Venkat, what's your recommendation?
I write a Substack newsletter called Contraptions. And I also run a program called the Summer of Protocols for the Ethereum Foundation. So a lot of my work is in those two places. So if you if you look for Contraptions on Substack or the Summer of Protocols, just search it on Google, you'll find a lot of what I'm up to these days. But beyond that, yeah, basic information about me is venkateshrao.com. So the basic 411 stuff is there.
Okay, cool. All right. Well, thanks for being here.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so that is the program for today. I appreciate everybody joining us for the conversation. And you can always get more if you go to theoryofchange.show. We have the video, audio, and transcript of all the episodes. And my thanks to everybody who is a paid subscribing member. Thanks very much for your support. We have options on both Patreon and Substack. If you are interested in becoming a paid subscriber, that is very helpful. Thank you very much. And if you can't afford to do that right now, I understand these are tough times for a lot of people. But you can help out the show if you share it with your friends and your family. That would be much appreciated as well. And if you are watching on YouTube, please do click the like and subscribe button so you can get notified whenever we post a new episode. All right, so that'll do it for this one. Thanks a lot for joining me, and I'll see you next time.